I am Adrienne. This is Hester, if you haven't been here before, if you're new. And Hester owns and runs classical education books. And so we're here today talking about teaching history in our homeschools. And I'm the mother of 7, you are the mother of 4. You love history.
Yeah.
Didn't grow up loving history, but my husband's degree is in history. So I've learned to love history, and I think all my children have the history gene. They all really, really like it to varying degrees. Some are all in, but everybody sort of, they know way more than I do. I've kind of learned.
Just listen to them and learn. That's really that's cool too.
Yeah, as they've shared the stories that they've read.
Yeah.
You know, everybody seems to really like historical fiction.
Yeah. Yeah, historical fiction is a highly underappreciated genre.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
We should be doing more with that for sure. Yeah.
I agree.
So today we're going to talk, as we've advertised over and over, we're going to talk about 2 different ways to approach history so that we can effectively communicate the experiences of the story of humanity, really, which is what it is. In his book, The 7 Laws of Teaching, John Milton Gregory says, teaching in its simplest sense is the communication of an experience. And this is certainly true of history. History is the experience of mankind over a period of really only 70 centuries. But even though 70 doesn't sound like much, those centuries have seen exploration and discovery, conflict and strife, poverty and illness. And yet when we compare one century to another, we can actually see vast changes and improvement, particularly in living standards and accessibility to food and shelter and education. So how we approach history then is going to influence the way we even think about our present time and our present culture. But the one thing that has not changed, so in spite of the developments economically, what has not changed through 70 centuries is the behavior of humans, the behavior of mankind. Through every century, mankind has behaved in the same way, in the same predictable way. And we need to recognize one of the reasons for that is because we are made in the image of God. We are communicating using language as created and as one of the persons of God, Jesus, who is the Word. We're using language to communicate our experience, and we bear that image of God in us. And so our behavior, mankind, has just never changed, despite all of the changes around us. So as we read history, we can start to learn about who we are, about ourselves. What has happened is the result of human choices, really. So we can learn where we came from, we can learn how we've become who we are, both personally, individually, but also corporately. Like, how is this country, Canada, the way it is? Why is it not a republic like the United States, but why is it still kind of under a monarchy? What has made that happen? These are important questions to understand how we behave as Canadians. We are not Americans, and we are very particular about saying that. So why is this important? And we can understand this through the study of history. And we can also understand why we make the choices that we do. So it's important. Let's listen. We have to listen to history. We have to understand what's happened, but we have to approach history in a particular way. There are many ways to teach history. There are many methods. There are many reasons why one would want to teach history. I'm thinking of maybe creating a timeline. I know for some people it's really important that there's a timeline in their child's minds, so that they have certain pegs of information, and then as you learn more, you can hang that information on those pegs and flesh it out. So that's one of the reasons why they sometimes want to. You could study history because you want to know how civilizations developed, or how we've gone from sort of a caveman idea to we're so sophisticated today, living in buildings with running water right in our homes. Like that is extreme sophistication. How did that happen? So there's many reasons why we would want to, and the methods that we would use, but how we approach history, how we come to the study of history, I believe there's two ways to do that. And the first is what I would call analytical. Analytical study of history would appeal to those who are looking for the timeline, or those who want to observe civilizations rising and falling. It approaches history from the outside, and it looks at it as a kind of cause and effect phenomenon. Like as in the end can justify the means. This was a good result for humanity, and so how we got to there, well, it's too bad, but at least here's where we are, and that was good for mankind. So it does a very I guess a historical analyst. They record statistics. They can satisfy intellectual curiosity and just fill notebooks and notebooks with dates and events and names and a lot of data. They can come away with a narrative knowing exactly what can be accomplished by human ingenuity and intelligence. So the analytical approach is largely an intellectual exercise of sorts. It doesn't often trickle down to our emotions or our feelings, and it is often, like a lot of times if someone says they find history boring, it's because they've only ever been approaching history from an analytical perspective. And so it is just a list of dates, of people, of statistics, of mountains and lakes and oceans and rivers. So
that would have been me in high school.
Right.
Why do I need to know about these people that lived hundreds of years ago?
Yeah.
I felt like it wasn't relevant to my life.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's about as interesting as how to build a skyscraper.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what I would call analytical, and that's one way to do this. The second way to approach history is what I would call dialectic. And dialectic is really easy to, especially to young children, because it appeals to a child's insatiable thirst for stories. So dialectic is a deep dive into a time or a place with a person or into an event. And you would do that alongside the story. The teacher, who is in a dialectic case, the teacher is actually the storyteller, not use the parent, really. And so with a dialectic, what you would do, instead of having like an timeline approach to history, what you would do is have a reading plan and have as what we would call as historical fiction or living books to help them to go deep into history and to meet people in a fictitious way or in a real way if there are things like biographies or autobiographies that have been written and that we want to pursue. So this really gets at the complaint that history is dry and boring. When you are reading a story about the life of Laura Secord, for example, she alerted James Fitzgibbon to the fact that the Americans were coming and they were going to take him in battle, and because of that he was able to be ready and he won the battle. And it was really like there was like this 24-hour period. She did something hard. She warned the general, and that's it. So you could put that down as a date, or you could read the life of Laura Secord. She was married. She had a very tiny little white cabin that she was careful to keep neat. As you read the story of her and what compelled her to want to make that journey, which was essentially her faith in God. She had to do this. She knew about it. She believed that she was called to do this. Makes a completely different story. So suddenly we're falling in love with Laura Secord and we find her fascinating. The important thing about this is that this story will appeal to our immoral imagination and even more importantly, our child's moral imagination. So where the analytic will show our ability as humans of what we can accomplish. What the dialectic will do will have the children saying, yes, but what ought we to do? Not what can I do, but what ought I to do? Given these stories, given these times and places, given these people that made these choices, what ought I to do? A dialectic will often will not kind of sit in judgment over history or over the events or the people or choices. Dialectic will sit beside. We won't ask questions. We won't ask judgmental questions, but we will ask questions like, why would you make that choice? Why do you feel compelled to behave in that way? Or those kinds of questions. So it's not a matter of this happened, then this happened. It's a matter of, why would you choose that? And in that way, we can start to understand and enter in to the other's reality and experience, and it will affect our own experience. We will find especially with children, we can take them to times and eras and periods to experience things that we wouldn't really want them to experience in real life,
Right.
Not necessarily,
Mm-hmm.
right? But it would be great for them to feel that discomfort of like a pirate ship and the lying awful pirates and like a child ran away from home because he thought it was exciting and it actually turns out to be those are things we would never want that to happen. And at the same time, the child can have that experience and come away from it going, wow, that was not at all what I expected.
Right.
And we can have that. So that's what I would call the second approach, which is dialectic. And ultimately, so as we're teaching history, what we're learning is that life is so much more complicated than a formula or even a system. And history properly observed, it will teach us that. It's not about how much we've accomplished and as human beings, it's about how we have survived and even how we have thrived over the 70 centuries of human history. And so my question then would be, how are we going to spend our short years on this planet?
Right.
And now you're thinking, how would I do that practically? So that's great. Dialectic, analytic, looking at, going in, what does that look like practically? So that's something I would like to talk about next. I would like to address that. So analytic teaching can be done, analytic teaching can be done with some great narratives that tell the story of history. What we're looking for in analytical is like a story. Everyone knows Susan Weisberg's Story of the World. That is a fantastic analytic approach to history. There are many others that would take that approach. Encyclopedias are also a great resource for analytical study of history. You can get just all the dates and all the points of history, what happened, what we really should know through encyclopedias. And a timeline is essential to analytical study, and the purpose for that is so that we can create those pegs.
Right.
As I believe Susan Weisberg calls this pegs in one of her books, where we learn these dates, we memorize these people, so we have this idea in our mind that history is linear. It started in from one point, it's going in one direction and it's going forward. It's not. It has a beginning and it will have an end. And along that line, there will be points that are important that change how the story of humans has progressed. So it's important to have a timeline. I actually think it's really important for a child to write a timeline. So if you're doing an analytical approach, it can be very easy with just an ordinary notebook.
Yeah.
You could buy fancy, glossy hardcover books with numbers in them, and that's great. But when you're doing analytical, it's very easy to start from the beginning and have them write the date and then even a paragraph of what they learned. So I think so whether you purchase something that you can put on the wall as you study or whether you get a notebook, timeline is really important for analytic.
And I would say it's really important for those kids, like I have one right now who loves history, but doesn't want anything to do with anything textbooky. So I even tried to get her to read through Story of the World, not interested. I'm trying to give her some sort of timeline foundation so that it's not just all these stories, but instead that she understands that, oh, these two things were happening at the same time in different parts of the world, and that kind of thing. And she's not into it at all, but loves history. And so what I've been doing or encouraging her to do is to keep reading like she's reading, but then plug in that information as she goes. So she might be in completely different eras from one week to the next, and there's no real linearness, if that's a word, to her reading. But then when she goes back and plugs it in, that's when she can go, oh,
yeah,
interesting. This happened just after that other book I read, because she loves historical fiction, and I don't want to crush that. But it is important to have.
It is important. And we'll talk a little bit more about that with the dialectic too, because with dialectic it sounds like she's more of a dialectic learner, right? And so it's harder to do a timeline because they tend to go, oh, I'm going to read about this person, I need to know more about this event, right? So so that's a very real challenge with dialectic. With analytic, especially these kids who are just really, you know, good at academics and they love these textbooks, a timeline is the easiest thing to put together. I think the one thing about analytic I just want to mention before we move on to dialectic is that analytic should be taught chronologically, ideally starting from the beginning of creation and then moving forward. There are a lot of different ways to break it up. I think most people break it up into 4 cycles, so it would be 4 years. You cover ancient, Greece and Rome, medieval, and modern history. The challenge for that is if you are teaching multiple ages and you're starting your 4th cycle and your 6-year-old is just kind of starting to join your family, like, oh dear, do you have to start teaching creation and modern? And I would suggest no, not at all. The beauty of teaching in this way is that you just have your children join you when they're ready, and you do your cycle twice. So maybe your 6-year-old's going to start in with modern history, but the next year you're going to start back at creation again. And so your 6-year-old's going to get creation, but your older kids are going to see it again for the second time, and it goes down way deeper the second time. And the questions are very rich. And so while it needs to be taught chronologically, it doesn't necessarily need to be taught in the proper sequence. You can start halfway, but wherever you start, go to the end and then start from the beginning again. Does that make sense?
It does make sense.
It gets complicated when you're teaching multiple children, but not as complicated as we might think. You just carry on. And just have everyone come join in. So that's the one thing about analytic. So dialectic, what does it look like practically? I think most of us are familiar with analytic. There's very little out there that is dialectic. So dialectic involves a lot of historical fiction or biography or autobiography. It can be done based on a child's interest, and that can be a little bit hard to peg when your child hasn't read a lot. And so what I've loved to do is you could do a chronological study of history using the dialectic method. So that means when you're studying, say, ancient Egypt, read G.A. Henty's Cat of Bubastes. Or read Daughter of the Nile. Or read, so there's many books that actually talk about people in that time. And once you finish that, you can maybe read something about Babylon, or you could read something about ancient Greece, and then starting. So that's kind of the way we've done it, which can be done quite easily because there are so many books out there about so many stories about these time periods.
And you can lean into a little heavier on the areas that your kids really gravitate towards. If they love the timeline, you can just do, maybe you're just going to pick a few of the historical fiction novels to read through or whatever. Or the other way around. You can just do basic timeline stuff and really lean into the reading. Because they're devouring book after book after book.
And that's one thing that I think is really important with dialectic is there should be some kind of timeline aspect to it. As you're saying with your daughter, you're trying to help her to sort of put some kind of timeline together, right? I think a book of centuries is really helpful for a dialectic student. So for analytic, they're going to be starting from the beginning anyway. You can use a notebook. They're going to be going through just like that. But for dialectic, because they might even bounce around a little bit, right? It's like, I'm so interested in Joan of Arc, and they read everything about Joan of Arc. And they're like, wait a minute, there was something going on in the Battle of Tours with Charles Martel that I hear echoes, and they go back over there. So with the Book of Centuries, the numbers are already printed on the pages. And so what you would have your dialectic student do then is finish their historical fiction and then write a paragraph about that event in that book of centuries. So they start to write their own timeline, and it might not be chronological, but their timeline will be chronological. So they can go through it and see where the gaps are. So maybe there's a point where you're like, listen, we've never studied this era right here. Oh, well, that's like 18th century England. I'm not even, I don't care. I'm not interested. Like, fine. But I want you to read a Jane Austen book and then you can be done.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's definitely the need to have a discipline of timeline in dialectic where dialectics aren't heavy on timeline.
Yeah. They resist.
Yeah, they just want to read the books and read some more books. I was definitely dialectic.
Yeah.
Yeah. And dialectics will typically love history more, but again, that's back to the story, right? They're reading these stories about these people who've been in real events and faced real choices and had to make real decisions, and they experienced real consequences. You know, you could have just a fictitious story and go, oh, that couldn't possibly happen, and walk away from it. But Joan of Arc really happened, and she really made some choices. I'm most fascinated about her because she was so young and she was so determined, and she suffered such a severe consequence, in my opinion. And so getting to know this person, or even Eleanor of Aquitaine, incredibly important person, but kind of behind the scenes in history. So reading about these people can inspire a passion in your children for the human condition, really saying what's happening with our choices, what's happening with our decisions, and they have real consequences. So that is that's kind of a summary of how I would approach this practically. Ultimately, whether you're doing analytic or dialectic, you always pursue the questions with more books.
Yes. I loved that part in your writing. When I first read it, I highlighted and circled, and yes.
Yeah.
I know. I feel like homeschooling is just our homeschooling is very much like that, where you read something and then it draws you on. There's just naturally another thing to learn about. You know, last year we read, as a read aloud, A Treasure in the Snow by
Patricia St. John.
Yeah. And we ended up ordering wood carving tools and wood, and I have one child that's just taken off with wood carving because one of the characters in the book was a wood carver, and
that's what happens.
And I don't know, I just love that. And I mean, I didn't set out to teach it.
No,
we didn't set out to buy carving supplies and wood and watch videos. It just happened naturally.
But this is the thing about stories. In a well-crafted story, particularly a person or a historical experience, so you know this happened, this is real, right? You will be exposed to ideas that you might not normally encounter in daily life. Yeah. Like, would you ever have put on your curriculum at the beginning of the year, this child is going to do a wood carving course, right? No. You wouldn't. No. So a good story and meeting someone from the past will inspire us, and it will inspire our children to do things that we might never have previously thought of.
Yeah, I completely agree. Yeah.
And so it opens our horizons so broad.
And it's fun, and I think it makes lifelong learners.
I agree.
It's really if you can allow yourself to veer from your schedule, which you really should.
Which is very important.
And to go, you know what, we're not going to do this, but we're going to let this carry on.
Yeah.
And we're going to learn about wood carving or whatever it is that you read. They'll do that. Or my hope, anyway. I feel like I see it in my older children. My hope is that then they will just continue to do that throughout their life.
Right, because what we're trying to do is give them the tools for life. We're not trying to give them a comprehensive body of knowledge from which they will draw for the rest of their lives after the age of 18.
The box closes and
here you go, child. You are now on your way. Yeah. That's not how it is. Life is going to be a learning experience.
Yeah.
And I hope that when I am 80 years old, if I make it, and I read a book on wood carving, I would start wood carving.
Yeah.
You know, we should have that desire to want to keep on moving forward and doing something new. It doesn't matter where you're at in life or how old you are.
Or to just naturally be reading a book and then wonder, oh, where is that country? Or just to walk over to the map and, you know, you're a few chapters in and this country's been mentioned or that country. And
yeah, I'm always fascinated by the geography of a story, right? Because it will talk about even the story of Laura Secord. Geography is so important. Like she walked through a swamp, and there were snakes that she was having to avoid, and then she walked through a really dark forest with very tall trees, and then she had to walk up a steep incline. And so you're like, okay, so where was this? Like, what kind of geography? Or even if you read the story of like Charles Martel in the Battle of Tours, he had the advantage because he was up on a hill, and his enemy had to come and attack from the bottom of the hill. So again, looking at it, you're just like, so what's happening here? Where are the mountains and the hills? Where are the trees? Because the geography will affect the outcome of the story, and it will affect the decisions that people make. Like, can I run up that hill while shooting at my enemy? You know? So I love maps.
Yeah.
Like a good book with a map.
Yeah.
So, okay, there's another little tip on
I know.
practical.
Sometimes we get a little off topic, but
I like it when we go off topic. Okay. So we've discussed the two approaches to history. We could approach it analytically or dialectically. And we've talked about practically what would that look like, what resources would we choose for either one, but we have not yet discussed the actual resources.
Right.
So let's talk about resources. One of my favorite conversations too.
Yeah.
Let's start with Analytic. One of the most popular analytics is this series from Susan Weisberg, Story of the World. We got a glare. There we go.
Oh.
We have all of the revised editions here. They've all been revised, and you can just read the story if that's what you need. Just the story. The story is it's really good. It's easy to read. She's just one of the. She's so clever. I have such high regard for Susan Weisberg. And so this is something you could do. It comes with an activity book, which includes mapping, which I like, as I have mentioned before. And it includes projects, foods. So the activity book, it can be a bit overwhelming, and maybe it's something where you would just kind of pick and choose.
I found that for sure.
Yeah, but there is that option, and I think it's neat when you have options to add on or to take off. So that is Analytic. And another one, this is relatively unknown, but I think it should be better advertised. Susan Weisberg also wrote a history for high school and adults. I've done this one personally, and it was funny, it was gritty, it was really entertaining for a analytical history text. So this would be something you could do with your high schoolers. There's even a study and teaching guide, and she has 3 volumes with this one going all the way up to the end of the medieval times. So those are 2 really good analytic ones. There's also The Mystery of History. Well, Susan Weisberg tries very hard to stay away from history as a theological treatise. Mystery of History really does focus on history from the perspective of the church. So in the first book, it would be the perspective of the Jewish nation, and then Mystery of History, this is the 2nd volume. It's on the early church in the Middle Ages. So she really pursues church history through here, whereas Susan Weisberg doesn't even touch on that.
Right.
Well, that's not true. She touches on it, but she doesn't necessarily follow that story.
Right.
So they're both analytic, and they both have a very different emphasis. And I've done them both because
we've done Story of the World more thoroughly. I like Mystery of History because I really like the connection to his story. Like it's but Story of the World was a little more simple.
It is more simple. Yeah.
And there actually is somebody online that, if you're going to get both resources, I mean, probably would have been worth just somebody's blog where they've combined the 2. Like if you were going to read them both, that this is sort of the order, this book and this chapter, and this book and that chapter. Yeah, maybe I'll try to find that and even
post a link. Yeah, that would be helpful. Yeah. This is a newer analytical work, The Curious Historian by Classical Academic Press. And if you are a classical educator and you like to teach Latin, pick me. This would be fun because it does have the original words. It goes back to like the root words, and well, it's always going to be Latin in my mind. Okay, fine, maybe not always. There are activities, there's questions, there's a timeline in here. I think it's really great as there's mapping. So I think it's great as a analytical work, particularly if you are already teaching like Latin or if you're planning to move toward like original texts with your students as they get older. So those are three of some of my favorite analytical resources. There are more out there. Like it's way easier to find analytical than it is to find dialectic. But those ones, I would say, those are some I highly recommend.
You're really pulling things together on your own.
Kind of
with the...
Yeah.
So where would you put like the Veritas Press? Because you're right, it's not a textbook you're reading.
Yes.
Right? They're directing you to readings
Yes.
and books.
Yeah,
I guess it's more analytical.
I think it's a good mix of analytic and dialectic.
Yeah, because they do have historical fiction suggestions.
Yeah.
In some of their...
Yeah.
It's been a while since I've looked at the cards.
Yeah.
History cards, but...
Yeah, it's a good mix of both, and you really could use Veritas Press history either way. But you could, because with their history packages, they have the analytic texts like encyclopedia, Journey Through the Bible, those kind of analytical things. But they also have a selection of novels, historical fiction novels, right? So, and then they have the timeline already being created. Yeah. So I think it's a really great mix between the two. I'm not sure if you could either pick one or the other and say we're not going to do those texts, we're just going to do the novels. I'm not sure. But like we mentioned earlier, you could kind of lean into one more than the other depending on the interests of your children. Exactly. Yeah. And you don't need to choose between one or the other. Yes. You just, you don't need to. You could move from dialectic into analytic as your student goes, hey, I've read a lot, I just don't have an idea how it all fits together. And you say, okay, here we go with analytic, right? Yeah. So you don't need to be picky or say, I'm going to pick one or the other. You can, knowing that there are two ways to approach, you can say, okay, I think we could spend more time focusing on the stories because we don't have a love of history. Right. Or we don't understand that that everything we've learned, this whole timeline has been the effort of human initiative or of human choice, of human blood, sweat, and tears, right? It's just in our minds, this is what happened. So, but there are a few resources for dialectic. I love the Famous Men series from Memoria Press. They have Famous Men of Greece, Rome, Middle Ages, and Modern Times. They really just have a lesson, 35 lessons about various characters in history who affected change. So Famous Men of Rome. It's also a nice colorful text. The art is really great. So Famous Men of Rome, a lot of these men are men we've never really heard about. But when you read through them and you hear the stories, you're like, oh, that's why this happened. So Diocletian was one of the emperors who persecuted the Christians. And it talks about that and who he was as a character. Marcus Aurelius, there was Christian persecution under him. But what about Julius Caesar? And then after he died, who came in next? And how were their lives, how did their lives affect not only who would come after them, but what kind of a reign that they would have? And how did that affect the people? So I really do like these. It's a nice, easy way to do dialectic. The other resource is Beautiful Feet. They have these guides, and these are probably the best dialectic guide out there. Okay. This one's on ancient history, and the guide is really not that intimidating. There's 70 pages-ish onto this one, but it's all about the historical fiction. So this is the required literature for your ancient history. It's about the it says intermediate to junior high. So there's another book list of books. So what you're going to do is take the guide. You must have the books because you're going to be following what the guide says. Lesson 1. You're going to read through the pages 6 through 7 of the Encyclopedia of the Ancient World. You're going to introduce the Book of the Golden Bull and read chapters 1 through 4. They have put maps together. They have you have to write essays and connect some of the statistics with, like, from the encyclopedias to the stories that you're reading, so that you can find the reality in the story. It's historical fiction, so there's going to be some things in there that are not true, but what is true, right? So we want to be able to point that out. So I would say beautiful feat. They have ancient history, medieval history of various levels from K through 7. I think they do high school as well. They are some of the best dialectic out there. And then there's just really good novels. The latest that we love is this story. It's newly published by Living Book Press. It's the He Went With stories. This one is even relevant to Canadian history. And they're just good, fun stories. They have illustrations in them, rather bigger text, so it's easy for children to read on their own. But these are just...
I'm taking one of those home today.
I want to, but I have too much already to go through. So you can also kind of pick and choose, like go find the historical fiction section, pick up a book, read through it, and then see where that takes you. My daughter read The Nor'Wester, a story of Simon Fraser and the discovery of the Simon Fraser River. She raves about it and tells me, I haven't read it. Yeah. I can't keep up with her. Oh. And yeah. So she's telling me all these stories about the Fraser River, and then in our Latin we had to talk about the Flumen Fraserus Riverius. Okay. Yeah, I know. I love teaching kids. They just they see things the way we don't. Then one final resource, the Book of Centuries. There are many different styles. These are only 2. And the Book of Centuries has, as I stated, pre-printed dates, and it's in chronological order. So this would be for your dialectic student, particularly your dialectic student who doesn't like writing much, because there's very little space to write about a century. But what you'd want them to do is, after they've read a book, find that in the Book of Centuries and write something so that you can see what they've learned and what the gaps are, and you can fill those in. This one I like a little bit better. It has the dates too, but it gives much more space to write in those dates. And I think it also breaks down, it breaks down the time period. So this is ancient, medieval, New World, and it has some dates in it already too. So, but like I said, there are many different kinds of Book of Centuries. Do your research and see if there's something that will work well for your family. All right?
That was really good. Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us today.
Okay. Bye for now.